The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Alan Blumkin on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. We're here for another session of David Nemec's Old-Time History and Trivia. And my guests today are my usual co-host, David Nemec, and no stranger to these airwaves, Ian Kahanowitz. Welcome.
Hey, good to be here.
Good to be here for me, too.
Yeah, today we're going to discuss the 1965 and 1966 seasons, which is going to be a little bit strange for us because the Yankees are not going to have a prominent role in this particular segment. So, do either of you want to start with 1965 at all? Or should I provide? I'll provide a little overview. The 1965 season was marked by a couple of major events. The biggest one was the collapse of the New York Yankees. The second biggest probably was the opening of the Houston Astrodome, which is apropos in light of what happened last night. And the third thing is the last year of the Braves in Milwaukee. Okay, and there was the usual on-field activities, and it was a strange year, as I said, because the Yankees would collapse and they wouldn't return to relevance until 1976. Okay, will you either of you like to share your memories of the season?
I think we need to add a fourth thing, and that was the sudden emergence of the Minnesota Twins. I mean, this was a surprise pennant, and this was a team that hadn't been in postseason play, the franchise, since 1933, 32-year dry spell, and they really hadn't even come close to postseason contention in most of those years, except 1945, which is a story in itself. But other than that, the Washington Senators, who became the Minnesota Twins, really were seldom a factor. And I, for one, was pleased to see them. I saw their opening day game in 1965. Happened to be in Minneapolis at the time. And it was a precursor of what was to come. They won in extra innings, beating none other than the Yankees. And people there, were really overjoyed just to see a victory over the Yankees, little knowing what was going to come to pass with both teams that year. And we're certainly going to talk about that.
Well, about the Yankees, the strange thing about the Yankees is after the loss to the St. Louis Cardinals in the '64 World Series, the off-season saw them get rid of Yogi Berra and bring on his arch foe in the World Series, Johnny Keane. You had a Yankee that was still pretty good. You had Mel Stoudemire as pitcher, but you had some injuries. And I think the biggest one of them all was, I think it was Roger Maris. I mean, he had a huge injury, and that really hurt the play. Joe Pepitone, he had a good season, but not near what they needed. I think that they got rid of Mel Allen at the end of the year, and CBS started its reign pretty much, as its owner, and it just didn't fare well. Johnny Keane, I get to speak to Fritz Peterson like twice a month, and he was telling me, the players just didn't, mesh well with Keane. He just wasn't the right fit.
Hey, to interrupt you, also a couple of other factors was that turned out to be Tony Kubek's last season, and Jim Bouton crashed. He went from 18-13 with 2 World Series wins the year before in 1964 to 4-15. He hurt his arm, and it really never come back to the way it was in 1963 and 1964.
Also, Mantle was getting older.
Oh, yeah, they were all getting old. Ford that's why Ford's last effective year. He was 16-13. But one of the things that has been brought up is that when Topping and Webb, the two owners, decided to get out, And I think when an ownership decides to get out, the first thing that goes is player development.
Now here's an interesting question for you. You had CBS owning the New York Yankees, and both of you were around in 1965. I wasn't around until 7. Well, my question to you is, with that kind of resources, why, and now we're coming into an era where the Yankees had that wonderful dynasty from 49 to 64. Why didn't they upkeep their farm teams like they did for all those years? Because, again, free agency is not on tab yet. And the Yankees,
because
again,
who knows how long, it was in the minds of Topping and Webb to sell the team. As I mentioned before, the first thing that goes is when an ownership decides to get out is the farm system and player development. And plus, 1965, they instituted the free agent draft.
Yeah, which is a big thing.
That's another thing that I should have mentioned, but that really knocked the Yankees for a loop.
That may be the biggest thing of all.
And basically, after the Yankees had brought up Stottlemyre and a couple of other players in late 1964, they had the farm system was totally bare. And when these guys, the Mantles and the Marises and the Howards and the Fords and the Treshes, all these players, long-time players, got either injured or hurt or getting ready for retirement, there was nobody to replace them.
Yeah, and the Yankees really hadn't done much of a job with minorities, and they had some minority players, but they certainly weren't of the caliber the other teams were signing, and it really caught up to them by the mid-'60s.
And everything you read about Johnny Kane's tenure there, they couldn't stand him, the players. They thought he was, a lot of them were veterans used to doing things a certain way, and Kane went there and tried to impose some sort of discipline, telling everybody has to fight for their job, blah, 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 blah. And they just didn't buy into it, or wouldn't buy into it.
I gotta agree with you both. In fact, with Dave, a little bit more with the minorities. I think if you read David Halberstram's October of '64, you could see, a very young Cardinals team that is integrated, severely. You got Bill White, they got Lou Brock that year. You got Bob Gibson, to name a few of the folks.
Kurt Flood, yeah.
Kurt Flood. The Yankees didn't have that. And, what David was alluding to, the minority thing, it just wasn't there. It was still white besides, say, Al Dowling and Elston Howard. And Elston Howard now is getting old. So, I think that caused, a major shakedown in the Yankee organization. Plus, I don't think CBS had a clue.
No, they didn't. They didn't.
I don't think they had a clue.
No.
So it'll be a money pot. The team would go on the way it had gone on for 45 years, and fans would buy into it and show up, and the television ratings would be strong. And it got to the point where the only reason you would watch the games anymore is to see after 1965 was just Mantle, because Ford was after 1965 Ford was essentially gone, even though he did pitch a little bit in '66 and '67.
Well, he
so
did.
That was it. The Mantle was Mantle was in the sliding down pretty quickly at that point.
Yeah, they had high hopes though for Bobby Mercer, and he was billed as the second coming of Mantle.
There were a lot of those.
Yeah, but Mercer really was an exceptional ball player. He really had the talent.
No, he went into the Army for 2 years.
Yeah, that really hurt his career, and I don't think he ever really got all the wheels on the road and going at the pace that he should have. He had some very good years in his career, and but essentially, I think everyone would probably consider him to be somewhat of a disappointment, all in all.
Yeah, the Twins wound up winning the American League by 7 games over the Orioles, who managed to finish second. And the Twins were paced pitching by Mudcat Grant and Jim Cott, the starters. And they had the sophomore player named Tony Oliva, or Pedro Oliva, who was one of the best hitters I've ever seen before he would tear his knee up, a number of years later. Killebrew missed a good part of that season with a torn hamstring. He missed about a month and a half. But they managed to, and they got a career year out of Zoyo Versailles, who was named the MVP that year. And he was the Twins shortstop. He led the league in total bases. He led the league in runs scored. He also led the league in strikeouts, and he had 319 on base percentage. I just looked this stuff up yesterday with the on base and the strikeouts. And that was his career year, and he would deteriorate to the point where he had the worst average of any regular in the American League in '67, and they shipped him to the Dodgers in 1968. He had the worst regular season, qualifying average in the National League. So
a couple other guys, a couple big, really good ball players, solid ball players, and Jimmy Hall and Bob Allison.
Yeah.
They got caught in what we talked about last week, the pitching domination of the 60s, and never really emerged fully as the kind of hitters they could have been, I think, in a later or earlier era. But they were, for a few years, for just a couple of years, Hall was solid, but Allison had a pretty good career all in all. And Earl Batty, we can't forget Earl Batty, who was really, I think, one of the best catchers in the game at that time.
One of their pitchers was, also starting to slide down a little bit, was Camilo Pascual, who started off his first 4 years with Washington from 54 to 57, had a record of 28 and 66, and he wound up his career with 174 and 170. And he was the ace of the early Twins teams, and he was still there, when they won the pennant in 1965. Over in the National League, the Dodgers, who had been in sixth place the year before, wound up winning the National League pennant by 2 games over the Giants, despite the fact that Tommy Davis, who was their main power hitter at that time, wound up breaking his leg early in the season and was out for the rest of the year. And they picked up a guy named Lou Johnson off the scrap heap, and he turned into be a catalyst for them. And they would go on to win the pennant by 2 games. Sandy Koufax would go 26-8, and again, like he did in 1963, lead the National League in every positive pitching category.
And you look at Lou Johnson. Johnson, amazingly enough, tied for the lead in home runs. And if we look back on it, how many home runs did he actually hit in Dodgers? They were playing in Dodger Stadium by then, as opposed to the Coliseum, of course. But Johnson hit all of 12 home runs. There were only three players on the Dodgers who had double-figure home run totals. Jim LeFevre with 12, and Willie Davis with 10, and Johnson with 12.
Well, the quintessential Dodger game that season was when Sandy Koufax pitched his perfect game in September and won the game 1-0, and the Dodgers got 1 run on 1 hit, and the 1 hit did not figure in the scoring.
Yeah.
Bob Henley was the opposing pitcher.
And
I think the Dodgers were the first team, I think, that ever win the pennant without a player scoring 100 runs or even getting as many as 80 RBI. Ron Fairley led the team in RBI, which is 70.
Well, the Giants that season only finished 2 games out, and they were missing Orlando Cepeda, who went down with a very bad knee injury very early in the season. And they were contending, and they had a 14-game winning streak, and the Dodgers followed them with a 14-game winning streak. And, of course, that was the year also of the Marichal-Roseboro incident, when Marichal thought that there's always bad blood between these teams anyway. Marichal thought that the pitcher was too close to his ear, and when Roseboro threw a ball that the Marichal felt just missed him, throwing back to the pitcher, he took the bat and he hit Roseboro over the head with the bat.
Yeah,
there was a melee there, and Marichal wound up getting suspended for 8 games and getting fined the tremendous sum of $1,750.
Well, at that time, that was a fair amount of money.
And about the incident, Marichal, and I had John Rosengren on my show to talk about, the game of their lives, the battle of their lives. And at the time, Marichal's family was back in the Dominican Republic, and there was a revolution going on. There was a civil war going on. He didn't hear from his folks in a few weeks. And Roseboro, who was the catcher of the Dodgers, of course, he was caught up in the whole Watts riot in Los Angeles. So going into the game, these guys were very, very nervous and high-strung to begin with because of their personal lives. And the thing about Marichal and Roseboro is when Marichal was going to, because he didn't get voted in on the first ballot of the Hall of Fame in the early 80s, Marichal we overlooked because he had the most wins out of any pitcher in the 1960s.
No, Koufax retired after 1966, which we'll get into a little later on. But you're right. I think that they held off the first ballot in because of that incident. And finally, on the third ballot, they put him in. Yeah.
But Roseboro, the thing with him, Marichal asked him in the early 80s. He's like, Johnny, I need some help. Roseboro went down to the Dominicans and helped Marichal get into the Hall of Fame by saying, look, everything's forgiven. And in fact, when Roseboro died in 2002, the only time Marichal ever mentioned the incident was he gave a eulogy at Roseboro's funeral, and he said, if I was to take back 14 seconds of my life, I would take that 14 seconds back. I think Marichal was remorseful. I think that, Roseboro actually did forgive him because he ended up on the Dodgers with Roseboro anyway.
Yeah.
75 Marichal. But that was huge, and people underestimate not only the bad blood between the Giants and Dodgers, but the fact that the Giants had a very good team throughout those years, only making the World Series in '62. They were always behind the Dodgers.
Yeah, I have to make a little statement on my team, the Pittsburgh Pirates, who that year finished 38 games out. They finally decided that Dick Schofield couldn't play shortstop, and brought up Gene Alley, and then Mazeroski missed the first couple of weeks with an injury. And when he came back, they played very good ball from about the end of May to the rest of the season, but they were too far gone. They put themselves in too much of a hole at the beginning. And Clemente, like Tony Oliva, repeated as the batting champion. Can anybody tell me who led the National League in the ERA in 1965? And I'm sorry, in runs batted in 1965.
In what?
The National League
runs batted in?
Yes.
In RBI?
When I saw this, I had completely forgotten it until I looked it up the other day.
1965. That's a good question.
I'll give you the answer because we'll be here all night. Darren Johnson.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
the Cincinnati Reds drove in 130 runs.
130, yeah.
Yeah, he was another Mickey Mantle.
Out of nowhere.
With the Yankees,
completely out of nowhere, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, it's,
And it was also the opening of the Astrodome. And Houston changed their name from the Colt 45s, leaving what Dick Rowe told me in 1985 was the most miserable place on earth, Colt Stadium. to play in the eighth wonder of the world, the Astrodome, which was the first dome stadium, and and they did try to grow grass in the place, and it didn't work. So Monsanto came into the business and invented AstroTurf, which which would turn into be a great surface for the maintenance crew, but for baseball, it would distort the game quite a bit until it was ended for the most part with the building of these current stadiums.
Yeah.
And the other thing was the Milwaukee Braves. The Braves had declined somewhat in attendance for the last few years because they weren't contenders, and the group that had bought the Braves from the Perinis bought them with the express intent to move them, especially after a lot of their TV area was cut off by the Minnesota Twins. And so the Braves wanted to move to Atlanta. And Milwaukee got an injunction to hold them to the last year of their lease in Milwaukee, which was 1965. And they finished fifth, and they drew somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 to their games. And then after 1965, they left Milwaukee to go to Atlanta. And the National League punished Milwaukee by not awarding them an expansion franchise one in 1969. The only reason I think that they even got a team back was because when the Seattle Pilots went bankrupt, Milwaukee was the only place that had a Major League Stadium available.
Yeah.
Anybody want to add anything to that?
No, that's a buried story. Not few people talk about that, but there wasn't a certain amount of enmity build up against the city of Milwaukee. After what they did, and what they did, I thought was completely justified under the circumstances. But
it was justified. And they really shafted Milwaukee over with the awarding of expansion. Anyway, let's discuss the 1965 World Series. It opened in Minnesota, and there was an issue because the opening day was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. And Andy Koufax, who would normally be expected to open the series, told the management, and he was supported by them, that he would not pitch on Yom Kippur. And they started on Drysdale in the first game, and Jim Grant beat him. And the second game, Koufax started, he was beaten by Jim Cott. So Dodgers are down 2-0 to the Twins. They go back to L.A. And the Dodgers win the next three, fairly easily. They go back to Minnesota, and Jim Grant wins the sixth game. The fifth game of that series was the Dodgers won on a shutout pitch by Sandy Koufax. So it comes down to the seventh game. The Twins are going with Jim Cott, and the Dodgers are in a quandary. Because in a normal rotation, Drysdale would have gotten the start. But Walter Alston and Koufax decided who was going to get the ball. And Koufax got the ball and went out on a 2 days rest, pitched a complete game, 2-hit shutout. And the Dodgers won the World Series.
I just think that had a lot to do with what how the rest of his career went, that he did that in 2 days.
Yeah, well, basically, can you imagine anything like that being done now?
No, but it's a different game, a very different game now.
Yeah.
To pitch a complete game in the World Series is almost, an epic feat.
Well, he had 27 complete games in both 1965 and 1966. Who knows how much all that took out of resulted in his early retirement. But we'll get into that in a little bit. Okay,
Koufax told Vince Scully that post-game interview that he and Drysdale had come to the ballpark not knowing which one would be on the mound. And according to Koufax, the manager announced it. Walter Alston announced the decision purely in strategic terms regarding the lefty-righty, kind of saying he worded his announcement without even using the pitcher's name, saying only that he thought he'd like to start the left-hander.
Koufax didn't. All the accounts I've read of that game, Koufax didn't have his curveball working, so he basically pitched a complete two-hit shutout with nothing but a fastball.
Yeah.
So in 1966, there was a major trade over the winter. The Cincinnati Reds had a superstar by the name of Frank Robinson, who did not particularly get along with the Cincinnati management at the time. So Bill DeWitt, whose prominence was that when he was running the St. Louis Browns in the 1940s to Train to Nowhere, decided that Frank Robinson was an old 30 and shipped him to the Orioles for pitcher Milt Pappas, and there were a few other fringe players in the trade. And this is the only time during the 1960s that a superstar was traded during his prime years. And Frank Robinson turned the Orioles into a pennant winner. They won the American League fairly easily. The Yankees collapsed all the way to 10th, last place, and they got rid of Johnny Keane after they started the season 4-16, and they brought back Ralph Houck. And the attitude towards Houck had changed because when Houck was the general manager for the two previous seasons, Houck took a very hard line with salaries. So a lot of the players who loved Houck when he was the manager in the early 60s did not have the same attitude towards him in 1966 when he came back. And they just completely collapsed. Ford's arm went. He had very big shoulder problems, and he was essentially done after the first couple of starts. Stottlemyre went from winning 20 games to losing 20 games. And I believe that was the start of the Horace Clarke years. Kubek had retired. Bobby Richardson, who was the second baseman for quite a while, announced his intention to retire after that season. Roger Maris had another injury-filled year and was traded to the Cardinals after that season for a utility third baseman named Charlie Smith. I think that was the year that your buddy Fritz Priestman made it to the Yankees.
He did, and he was brought up that April, and he just says, it was an amazing thing. He's coming to the Yankees from Chicago, because that's where he grew up, and he was in the minor leagues, and he's pitching with Al Dowling and Whitey Ford and Mel Stottlemyre, and he always says to me, Ian, I go to spring training, and I'm sitting on a bench, scared to death. Roger Maris is there, and all of a sudden this hand, I wasn't looking up, it was sunny, his hand reaches over and says, hi, Fritz, I'm Mickey Mantle. Like, he didn't know who Mickey Mantle was. To hear Fritz talk about it, but at the same time with Fritz, he said, look, I was on a team that was still supposedly to be good. The doctor screwed up totally on Maris's hand. He said that it was a hairline fracture that wasn't diagnosed, and it only got diagnosed when he was traded to St. Louis, he said. But with the 66 season, he said, it was the first time since 1913 that the Yankees would finish last.
Yeah, they also... 1965 was the first time since 1926 that they had finished out of what was, called the first division back in those days. That's another term that's, gone the way of the dodo bird.
But the Red Sox stayed out of last place by a mere half game, and had they finished last instead, it would be amazing now to look back because they would have gone from worst to first.
Yeah, the Yankees had three. Yeah, the Yankees only play 159 games that year. They had 3 unplayed games with the Senators, and obviously since these games didn't mean anything toward the pennant race, they weren't made up. The Orioles, on the other hand, had Luke Powell coming into his own, Davey Johnson at second, Mark Belanger at short. No, I'm sorry, it was Luis Aparicio was the shortstop on that team. Brooks Robinson at third, and Paul Blair, and they had pitching, and they finally, under the leadership of Hank Bauer, the stalwart Yankee outfielder for a dozen years, as the manager, they wound up winning the organization's first pennant since the 1944 St. Louis Browns, which the last time I was in Camden Yards, they don't acknowledge.
You know, the amazing thing about that team, they won 97 games, and their pitching staff was solid. Had guys who were really headed for good careers, but at that time, Jim Palmer was the big winner with 15 games. McNally was second with 13. And they had Bunker and Barber tied with 10. That was their big four staff.
Yeah,
and they only accounted for 48 wins.
In fact, Palmer after that season would go through 2 years of sinking as far as the lowest minor league with a bad arm before he would come back and resume his Hall of Fame career in 1969. And the Dodgers were in the National League was really exciting. The Dodgers were involved in a 3-team race between the Giants and the Pirates. And Dodgers were still the same with great pitching, weak hitting team they had been the year before. And it went down to the last weekend. Now, I went out to Pittsburgh for the last weekend. The Giants were in. And I met a friend of mine, and we went to the Friday night game was rained out, and they played a doubleheader Saturday. And the Pirates had to win both. And the first game, they were leading by a run, and Harry Walker brings in Pete Mickelson, who the Pirates had gotten from the Yankees in a trade for Bob Friend, who was just about done at that point. And once I saw Pete Mickelson come in, I knew him obviously from seeing him with the Yankees for 2 seasons. I turned to this kid in back, and they said, they just lost this game. He says, why? I said, you just watch. And they did. And the second game, Bobby Bolin, the Giant pitcher, pitched a 1-hitter, and the Pirates lost both games, and they were eliminated. The Giants had to play a makeup game with the Mets to force a tie if the Dodgers lost the last game of the season to the Phillies in Philadelphia. And Walter Olson tried out Koufax. Koufax beat the Dodgers and gave the Dodgers the pennant. That was the last game that Koufax pitched in the National League and his last win. They got to the World Series, and lo and behold, the Dodgers got 2 runs in the 3rd inning in Baltimore. No, wait a second. That was in Los Angeles, that game, I believe. Yeah, excuse me. That was Los Angeles. They brought in Mo Grabowski in relief. He shut the door down and pitched the last 6 2/3 innings of the game and struck out 11. The 2 runs that the Dodgers got in the 3rd inning of that game were the only ones they would get in the entire series. They were shut out by Jim Palmer, Wally Bunker, and Dave McNally. The last 2 games were 1-0. Koufax started the second game and was done in by center fielder Willie Davis, who made 3 errors in the outfield in the 2nd inning and opened up the door, and Baltimore scored I think it was 3 runs, and they won that game, and that was it as far as Koufax's career as a pitcher. So the Orioles and the Dodgers broke all the hitting futility World Series records that had been set by the Yankees against the Dodgers in 1963.
So, I think the great holdout of 1966 between Koufax and Drysdale was huge, because now
Koufax and Drysdale, yeah.
They were not going to say, look, hey, we combined for 49 wins in 65, and we're only going to go pay that. Now, what's interesting is, O'Malley didn't believe that they weren't going to not come to camp. Bavasi said, yeah, they'll be, they're not going to come, Walter. Walter believed he would show up. But in the end, they negotiated, which was a tinge of things to come with collective bargaining, that, hey, he got $125,000, Koufax. Drysdale got $105,000, and so the pitching was solidified. Now, what's interesting here is you can't talk about 1966 without, of course, Frank Robinson winning the MVP in the American League, but, of course, the emergence of Marvin Miller, which Red Barber said before he died in 92, if 3 people changed the course of baseball. Babe Ruth, he changed baseball. Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, changed America, and Marvin Miller just changed the economics of the game.
In fact, Robin Roberts, the Hall of Fame pitcher, was the one who brought the Major League Players Association to the attention of Marvin Miller. And he was the one that was primarily responsible for bringing Miller in to head the Players Union. And Roberts said he could never get a job in Major League Baseball after that. He wound up coaching for years at a college in Florida. But Marvin Miller, in the next several years, would play the owners like a drum, and wind up creating a revolution in the whole labor management relations of baseball, which is still in a great effect today.
And what do you say about that, Dave?
Well, it's true. It's true. I've talked with Marvin Miller. I spent a little time with him once, and he's quite an interesting guy. And it's a shame what baseball has done to him over the years. But I don't know what his thinking was when he first took the job. But he certainly changed the complexion of the game very quickly.
When Marvin came in, and I got the good fortune, and I think Alan saw my picture with Jimmy Driscoll. He was a player who came up in the 1960s and was with the Swinging A's in the 70 season, 71 season, and the 72 season. He played under Ted Williams and the Washington Senators, and he also played for a little bit on the 75 Reds under Sparky Anderson. He was telling me, like I read in the books, Miller would go around to all the camps and all the teams and try to get voted in as their union leader. And, and it was a time where baseball was changing where, look, these owners are crying, hey, I don't got any money to pay you, but now they're making revenues off of TV and baseball cards and all these things. And Miller's telling them, look, they're using your name. You're your own entity. And, of course, Miller was in the steelworkers union and created a very powerful union since he got there in 1950 after World War II. And now in 1966, he's here to shake up baseball. And I think the biggest thing, besides the reserve clause, which died 10 years later, the biggest thing I think Marvin Miller did was create arbitration in 1968 and 69, because that was really what did in the reserve clause. The court ruled against Kurt Flood in his quest to destroy it.
Really? Yeah. Does the name Dick Woodson ring a bell?
Yeah, that back in the 1950s, though?
No. Dick Woodson was the first player to go to arbitration.
Oh,
an arbitration to file and go through arbitration. He asked for $28,000 for, I think it was the whatever season it was, and the Twins offered him $23,000.
Yeah, and that was huge because, when you think of the reserve clause, you think of the poster child, George Weiss. You think of Yogi Berra pleading for an extra $5,000.
Yeah.
He won the MVP.
Yogi wouldn't take any nonsense from George Weiss. He threatened to, and then, finally Weiss realized that they couldn't afford to kick Yogi off. But anybody else, I mean, it's always been, I've always been fascinated by what if people like Weiss and Branch Rickey and were general managers now with free agency and these multi-million-dollar contracts. I mean, I don't think they could function under the system the way it is now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think they'd be able to either. I think, Finley sold off his team as soon as he saw he was going to lose them, just like Connie Mack did back in 1914. It was the same.
But Connie Mack didn't have Bowie Kuhn telling him he couldn't do that.
Yeah, and with Marvin Miller, it becomes. Look, he organized the first strike in 1972. Yeah. He was there in 1981, and the negotiator for the owners was Greeby. Now, Greeby acts, and I had the good fortune of having Jeff Katz on my show. He's the mayor of Cooperstown who wrote Split Season. He talked to Miller, and he spoke to Greeby, and he went to visit Greeby, and Greeby said, no matter how much he hated Marvin Miller, he wrote a note to the Hall of Fame saying he should be in because Miller was that much of a power to the players. And, it all changes in 1966, and, it's an amazing thing.
I read, I think it was, either Marvin Miller's book or some other book who said these owners are basically all very wealthy and probably nobody had told them no since they were 2 years old.
Yeah, that's true.
And so they weren't used to this. So they took them all the way through the courts, and they, after the Messersmith decision, and they lost on every level. And that they could thank themselves thank Miller that Miller was realized that it wasn't like football or basketball where you come in directly from college. That there was a minor league apprenticeship that they had to go through, and that the teams had had an investment in the players, and they settled on the 6-year free agency and the 5-year trade demands. Because Miller could have said, well, freedom means freedom. The draft is illegal. They can sign with anybody, and if they can leave after the rookie year, for greener pastures. So he actually threw them a bone because he understood what the business was. Because if you had owners that couldn't control a player even past for a certain time after he hit the major leagues, that nobody would invest in baseball anymore.
Yeah.
And another thing that happened after 1966 was the Dodgers, who were powerhouse for a number of years, went into their demise. Sandy Koufax retired because his elbow was extremely arthritic, and they couldn't do anything surgically back then. And he retired after a 27-9 season, where he led the National League pitchers and everything again. And he was the first 20-game hitter to retire after a season like that since Claude Williams and Eddie Seacott from the 1920 Black Sox.
Who did not exactly retire.
No. And Maury Wills, reluctantly, the Dodgers after 1966 had a trip to Japan. And Wills didn't want to go, and he reluctantly went. And, somewhere through the trip there, he decided he'd had enough, and he went back home. So he was the spark plug of the Dodger team and a real big factor in their success. O'Malley said, get rid of him. So they traded him to the Pirates for the late Gene Michael and Bob Bailey. And Wills bounced around with the Pirates and the Expos before he wound up coming back to the Dodgers several years later. But the Dodgers, would collapse after that season.
You know, what's interesting about Wills, I was looking at his career a few days ago. He was the only switch hitter in the history of Major League Baseball to retire prior to 1975 as a member of the 2000 Hit Club. It was thus far failed to make the Hall of Fame. And he also, during his career, had the highest career batting average of any infielder. Second base, shortstop, or third base, who compiled as many as 1,500 hits. So he wasn't just all stolen bases. He was a good ball player.
He made himself a good ball player. I don't know if either of you guys have read it, but there's an excellent book finished about 2 months ago called "The Last Innocents," about the early 1960s Dodgers, and it goes very, very deeply into the team, and it was. Book was a lot better than I expected.
Yeah, I heard
by a guy named Michael Leahy, I think it is. I don't know if you had him on your show, Ian.
No, I didn't, but I'm trying to track him down and the book, and he's going to get back to me. Yeah.
So, gentlemen, this was, I think, an excellent session. We'll wrap it up, and next time, we'll go into 1967 and 1968, which will be the last of the seasons before divisional play. And I want to thank you both for doing this podcast with me, and we'll see each other soon.
Hey,
my pleasure. Enjoyed it once again.
Okay, this is Alan Blumkin from the Comfortably Zone Radio Network signing off. Again, I want to thank both David Nemec and Ian Kahanowitz. I hope listeners get something out of this podcast, and we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.